In the winter of 1946, a Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad Ed-Dib was searching for a lost goat in the cliffs above the Dead Sea when he threw a stone into a dark opening in the rock and heard something shatter. He climbed inside and found clay jars that had sat undisturbed for nearly 2,000 years. What came out of that cave, and 10 others like it discovered over the following decade near the ruins of Qumran, would become the single greatest archaeological find in the history of biblical scholarship. Among the thousands of fragments recovered was something almost no one expected to find preserved in its original Hebrew and Aramaic. Multiple copies of a text called the Book of Enoch, a work so old it predates most of the New Testament, so respected in the ancient world that the Apostle Jude quotes it directly as authoritative prophecy, and so unsettling in what it claims that nearly every church that once accepted it eventually chose to quietly set it aside. Only one branch of Christianity never let it go. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church kept the Book of Enoch in its Bible continuously for close to 2,000 years, reading it as scripture while the rest of the Christian world moved on without it. And buried inside that text, sitting in plain sight for 2 millennia, is a number, a countdown. 70 generations, the book says, is how long a group of rebellious heavenly beings would remain bound in darkness before a final reckoning arrives. Scholars have argued for more than a century over what that number means and when the clock actually runs out. In recent years, independent readers running that same calculation, using different methods and different starting points, have kept landing in the same narrow window of time, the one we are living in right now. This is the story of what the Book of Enoch actually says, where it came from, why it disappeared from most of the world's Bibles, and why a growing number of people believe its oldest warning is aimed directly at the generation alive today. To understand why this text carries the weight it does, you have to understand who Enoch was supposed to be. In the book of Genesis, buried in a genealogy that most readers skim past without a second thought, there is one line about a man named Enoch that stands completely apart from everything around it. The text says, Enoch walked with God, and then he was not, because God took him. Every other name in that genealogy follows the same pattern. A man is born, he lives a number of years, he fathers children, and he dies. Enoch breaks the pattern entirely. He does not die. He simply walks with God until one day he is gone. That single strange sentence, tucked into a list of ancestors, became one of the most fertile seeds in the whole of ancient Jewish literature. If Enoch never died in the ordinary sense, ancient readers reasoned, then he must have gone somewhere. And if he went somewhere beyond the world of the living, he must have seen things that ordinary human beings were never meant to see. Over the centuries that followed, an entire body of writing grew up around that idea, texts describing what Enoch supposedly witnessed on his journey through the heavens. The most complete and most studied of these texts is known today as First Enoch, and it is not a short or simple work. It is a sprawling composite text divided into 5 major sections, each one addressing a different piece of a single overarching vision. Cosmic history from the very beginning of creation, the fall of a class of heavenly beings called the Watchers, the monstrous offspring those beings produced, the hidden mechanical workings of the sun, moon, and stars, a visionary sweep through the entire span of human history, and finally, a reckoning between the righteous and the wicked at the end of it all. Before going further into what the text actually claims, it helps to understand exactly how old we are talking about. Most scholars date the earliest sections of First Enoch to somewhere around the 3rd century before the Common Era, meaning parts of this text were already centuries old by the time of Jesus. Other sections, including the astronomical material, may be even older, drawing on Babylonian astronomical traditions that predate the Hebrew Bible in its final form. This was not a fringe curiosity scribbled by a single obscure figure. It was copied, circulated, translated into Greek, and eventually translated again into Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language of Ethiopia, a chain of transmission spanning multiple languages and multiple centuries that most ancient texts never survive. For a text this old and this strange, its footprint in mainstream religious history is surprisingly deep. The letter of Jude in the New Testament does not simply allude to Enoch in passing. It quotes the book by name and treats its prophecy with the same authority given to any other scripture, stating plainly that Enoch prophesied about the coming judgment of the ungodly. This means that Jesus and his followers lived in a world where the Book of Enoch was not some obscure fringe document. It was widely read, widely known, and clearly influential enough that a New Testament author felt comfortable citing it as settled prophetic truth. The discovery of multiple Enoch fragments among the Dead Sea Scrolls confirmed just how central this text was to at least one major Jewish community of the era. The Essenes, the sect widely believed to have authored and preserved the scrolls at Qumran, treated the Book of Enoch as essential reading, copying it out repeatedly alongside other foundational texts. And yet, despite all of this, when the major councils and communities of the early church began settling on which books would form the official biblical canon, Enoch was left out of nearly every version. It was not formally condemned as false. It was not declared heretical by any major early council. It was simply, gradually, quietly set aside, a decision that seems to have had far more to do with institutional convenience, changing doctrinal priorities, and the sheer strangeness of its content than with any considered judgment that the text itself was untrue. Some early church figures, including a handful of influential theologians in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, actually cited Enoch approvingly and treated it as legitimate scripture worth quoting in their own writings. It was only later, as church councils began the long process of formally closing the biblical canon, that Enoch quietly fell out of favor, in part because of discomfort with its portrayal of angels behaving in such explicitly physical and destructive ways, and in part because later theologians grew uneasy with a text claiming this level of specific structured knowledge about the future. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church stands as the one major exception to that pattern. To this day, the Book of Enoch remains part of the official biblical canon of the Ethiopian Church, read publicly, studied by clergy, and treated with the same reverence given to any other book of the Old Testament. The oldest surviving complete copies of the text come to us today, specifically because Ethiopian scribes kept copying it, generation after generation, long after the manuscript tradition had gone cold everywhere else in the Christian world. The oldest of those surviving Ethiopian manuscripts dates to roughly the 14th century, but the tradition of preserving the text there stretches back centuries earlier than that, making Ethiopia the single unbroken link between the ancient original and the text scholars study today, now to the part of the text that gives the whole book its reputation, and the part that modern readers keep returning to, the story of the Watchers. According to 1st Enoch, 200 heavenly beings, angels in the original conception of the term, looked down at the daughters of men and decided they wanted them for wives. This was not a passive temptation. The text describes it as a deliberate, coordinated decision. The Watchers descended to a specific physical location named in the text as Mount Hermon, and before doing so, they bound themselves to one another with a mutual oath, fully aware that what they were about to do violated the fundamental boundary between their nature and human nature. They went through with it anyway. What followed, according to the text, was not simply an act of forbidden intimacy. The Watchers are described as teaching humanity things that were never meant to be given to them so early and so fast. The text catalogs this teaching in remarkably specific detail: the forging of weapons, and with them, the machinery of war, sorcery, spellcasting, and the interpretation of omens for manipulation and personal gain, astrology and the reading of celestial signs in ways divorced from their proper purpose, the alteration of natural processes to produce results nature would never generate on its own, and the introduction of cosmetics, ornamentation, and personal adornment in ways the text links directly to vanity, deception, and sexual manipulation. In the internal logic of the book, none of this knowledge was neutral. It was knowledge given to human beings before they had developed the wisdom, the ethical frameworks, or the maturity to handle it responsibly, and the result was catastrophic corruption spreading across the entire earth. From the unions between the Watchers and human women came a race the text calls the Nephilim, described as giants, enormous and violent beings who devoured everything in their path, consuming resources far beyond what human society could sustain, and turning on ordinary people once there was nothing left to take. The Hebrew Bible itself references this same term in the Book of Numbers, where scouts sent into Canaan report seeing descendants of the Nephilim and describe themselves in comparison as feeling like grasshoppers, a brief and strange line that has puzzled readers for centuries, and that 1st Enoch expands into an entire origin story. According to the text, it was the sheer scale of this devastation, this world consumed by corruption and violence born from forbidden knowledge and forbidden unions, that made the flood necessary in the first place. The Nephilim were destroyed when the flood came, their physical bodies wiped from the earth, but the text makes a claim that is easy to miss and genuinely unsettling once you catch it. Their spirits did not die with their bodies. Those disembodied spirits, the text says, became the evil spirits that have afflicted, tormented, and corrupted human beings ever since, all the way down through history to the present day. As for the Watchers themselves, the text says they were captured, bound, and imprisoned in darkness, held in place specifically to await a coming judgment. And this is where the number comes in. In chapter 10 of 1st Enoch, an archangel is given instructions regarding the Watchers, and the text specifies exactly how long their imprisonment is meant to last. 70 generations. Not a vague reference to a long time, not poetic language about ages passing. A specific, countable figure. 70 generations, and then the imprisonment ends and judgment begins. This is the detail that has occupied readers, scholars, and increasingly modern amateur investigators for well over 100 years, because unlike most apocalyptic literature, which tends to deal in symbolic and deliberately unfalsifiable language, this passage hands you an actual number to work with. The obvious question follows immediately. 70 generations from when, and how long, is a generation supposed to be? This is where things get genuinely complicated and genuinely interesting. Ancient genealogies, including the ones found throughout the Hebrew Bible, do not use a single fixed length for a generation. Some biblical lineages imply generations stretching close to 100 years. Others suggest something closer to 25 or 30 years, roughly matching the age at which a person in the ancient world might expect to become a parent. Because there is no single agreed upon starting point and no single agreed upon generation length, every attempt to calculate exactly when the 70 generations conclude necessarily involves a series of interpretive choices, and different choices produce meaningfully different answers. Despite that uncertainty, the striking number of independent calculations, using different starting assumptions and different methods, keep converging on roughly the same window of time, somewhere in the neighborhood of the current era. Depending on exactly how you define a generation and exactly which starting point in the text you anchor the countdown to, the projected endpoint can be read as landing squarely within the lifetime of the generation alive right now. This is not a scientific prediction, and it should not be mistaken for one. It is a structured interpretive exercise built on ancient chronology and modern arithmetic, and it carries all the uncertainty that comes with that combination. But it is also the kind of convergence that is very difficult to dismiss outright once you have actually walked through the math yourself, which is precisely why it keeps resurfacing among readers who encounter this text for the first time. The Watchers section is not the only place in 1st Enoch where modern readers claim to find a startlingly precise structure. One of the 5 books that make up the larger work is known as the astronomical book, a section that most casual readers skip entirely because it abandons narrative drama in favor of highly technical description. Instead of angels and visions, this section reads almost like a manual, laying out in exacting detail how the sun, moon, stars, and seasons are supposed to operate according to a fixed, divinely ordained order. At the center of this section is a calendar, a 364-day solar year, divided into 4 equal seasons of 91 days each, with every season built from exactly 13 weeks. The result is a strikingly symmetrical, almost mathematically clean structure, one the text presents not as a theoretical curiosity, but as the single correct and authoritative way to measure time, with every other calendrical system implicitly treated as a corrupted deviation from the true design. This is not an isolated invention unique to Enoch. The same 364-day calendar appears in the Book of Jubilees, another Second Temple era Jewish text that, like Enoch, survived intact primarily because the Ethiopian church preserved it in its canon. And the Essenes at Qumran are widely believed to have organized their entire religious calendar around this exact same system, which helps explain why they valued the Book of Enoch enough to copy it so many times. This calendar dispute was not a minor technical disagreement among ancient priests. It meant that different Jewish communities were observing their holiest festivals on entirely different days of the year, a quiet but deeply consequential rift that placed the Essenes and their allies fundamentally out of step with the temple establishment in Jerusalem. The astronomical book insists that the heavens themselves never deviate from their prescribed order, that the sun and moon follow their paths with total precision, and that any disorder in the relationship between time and human life is not a flaw in the cosmos, but a flaw in human beings failing to track time correctly. Some modern interpreters have gone further, connecting this ancient language about celestial disruption to present-day observations about increasingly volatile weather patterns and irregular seasonal behavior, framing them as symbolic echoes of a text that quite literally describes the luminaries crying out in disorder as a signal that something has gone wrong in the relationship between heaven and earth. Perhaps the most structurally ambitious section of the entire book is a passage scholars call the Apocalypse of Weeks, found within the later chapters of 1st Enoch. This section takes the boldest step of all. It attempts to divide the entirety of human history, from the very beginning to the final judgment, into 10 distinct periods. It calls weeks, though these are not literal 7-day spans. They are long stretches of generational time, each one carrying its own defining character. The framework begins with Enoch's own lifetime and moves forward across the full arc of human civilization, treating all of recorded history as a single continuous story rather than a series of disconnected ages. According to this structure, the earlier weeks correspond to the great foundational eras of ancient history, the emergence of early civilization, the giving of the law, the building and eventual destruction of the temple, and so on through the ancient and classical world. It is the later weeks in this sequence that draw the most attention from modern readers, specifically the 8th and 9th. The 8th week, according to the text, is a period in which the righteous are given what the text describes as a sword, language interpreted not as literal warfare but as a shift in the balance of power, a period in which the house of the wicked is torn down and oppressive systems that once seemed untouchable begin to lose their grip. The 9th week that follows is described as a time of eternal judgment, a period when all wickedness is stripped from the earth, and when human beings, broadly and collectively, begin turning toward righteousness. The 10th and final week describes the ultimate transformation of the world into an eternal order beyond ordinary history altogether. Readers who attempt to map this 10-part framework onto known historical periods consistently find themselves placing the present moment somewhere in that 8th to 9th week transition, the point at which corrupt and oppressive systems become fully exposed and the process of judgment against them accelerates and becomes very difficult to reverse. What makes all of this land differently today than it might have a generation ago is the specific list of warning signs the text offers for identifying the period it is actually describing. These are not vague, endlessly retrofittable prophecies capable of being applied to literally any era in human history. They are specific, concrete categories of social and moral breakdown that the text asks its readers to watch for directly in the world around them. The normalization of violence to the point where it stops being treated as exceptional and starts being treated as simply how things are. The spread of deception until it stops functioning as an occasional lie and instead becomes the dominant operating mode of public life, shaping entire institutions, entire narratives, and the collective sense of what is even true. The corruption of children and young people specifically through exposure to knowledge, technology, and influence that moves faster than any framework for managing it responsibly. The concentration of extraordinary power in the hands of small groups who are no longer meaningfully answerable to any external moral standard. And the ongoing degradation of the natural world as a direct consequence of human activity pursued with no accompanying sense of responsibility. None of these conditions are unique to any single year in history. They have appeared in one form or another again and again throughout human civilization. And the text itself does not claim otherwise. What it claims instead is that there are specific moments when these conditions accumulate and intensify past a certain threshold, moments when the ordinary tools society uses to correct itself, law, tradition, institutional reform, simply stop being sufficient to restore any real balance. It is exactly this kind of threshold that a growing number of modern readers believe they can see forming right now in the scale, speed, and global interconnection of problems that no earlier generation in history ever had to face all at once, at the same time, on a planetary scale. It is worth pausing here to say plainly what this text is not claiming, because it is easy for the drama of the material to run ahead of what is actually written. First, Enoch does not name the year 2026. It does not describe modern technology, modern politics, or any specific modern event by name. What it offers instead is a set of structural frameworks: the 70-generation countdown, the astronomical calendar, and the 10-week division of history, each built on ancient chronology and ancient cosmology, each requiring a series of interpretive choices to connect to any specific modern date. Different readers making different choices about starting points and generation lengths will land in different places, and reasonable people looking at the exact same ancient text can and do disagree sharply about how, or even whether, any of it should be mapped onto the present moment at all. What makes this particular period stand out is simply how many independent readers, working through these calculations separately and without coordinating with one another, keep landing in roughly the same narrow window. That convergence does not prove anything in a scientific sense, and it should not be treated as if it does. But it is the kind of pattern that is genuinely difficult to shrug off once you have walked through the numbers yourself, and it is exactly the kind of pattern that has quietly pulled this 2,000-year-old text back into public conversation, after centuries spent almost entirely outside it. There is one more piece of the text that tends to get lost beneath all the warnings, and it may be the most important part of the whole book. First, Enoch is not simply a document of doom. It is just as much a document of preservation and hope. Running alongside every warning about corruption and judgment is a consistent thread describing a group the text calls the righteous, or the elect, the specific people for whom the entire vision was ultimately preserved and written down in the first place. According to the text, these are not people defined by institutional membership or by reciting the correct doctrine. They are defined by their basic refusal to participate in the corrupting systems the Watchers introduced into the world, and by their capacity to actually perceive what is happening around them, even when the machinery of deception the text describes makes that clarity difficult to hold on to. The same period the text identifies as the full expression of corruption is also, in its own framework, described as the period in which the righteous receive what the text calls new authority, a shift in the underlying conditions of the world that makes forms of resistance and correction possible that had previously seemed completely out of reach. This is not framed in the text as a passive, automatic outcome that happens regardless of what anyone does. The text is explicit that the direction any individual life takes within this larger unfolding pattern depends entirely on the choices that person makes while they are living through it. Which brings the whole story back around to that shepherd standing outside a cave above the Dead Sea in 1946, holding a fragment of a text that had been quietly waiting in the desert for nearly 2,000 years to be read again by someone who could actually understand what it was describing. The Book of Enoch survived because one church refused to let it disappear, because a scattered desert community hid it carefully enough that a lost goat and a curious teenager stumbled onto it centuries later, and because the New Testament itself preserved a direct quotation from its pages, ensuring it could never be fully erased even by those who wanted it forgotten. Whatever you make of the calculations, the countdowns, and the calendars, one thing about this text is not really in dispute. It was written, according to its own internal claim, for a future audience rather than for the generation that first encountered it, a generation the text says would recognize the world it was describing not as ancient history, but as the world they were actually living in. Whether that generation is the one alive today is a question this ancient text raises far more clearly than it answers, and it is a question that is apparently now spreading well beyond the small circle of scholars who have spent their careers quietly studying it, out into a much wider public that is encountering these chapters for the very first time and finding them far harder to dismiss than they expected to. Read it for yourself and decide what you make of the pattern. And if this kind of deep dive into the mysteries buried inside ancient texts is the kind of thing you want more of, make sure you are subscribed, because we are only getting started uncovering what the ancient world left behind for us to find